anticipated 2023 Annual Uehiro Lectures in Practical Ethics. And returning to hear Professor Tom Hurka deliver the second in this series. So Roger gave a lovely introduction to Tom earlier, which I won't repeat in detail, but Professor Hurka is the Jackman Distinguished Chair of Philosophical Studies at the University of Toronto, and we're delighted to welcome him back tonight. In the first lecture in this series, I'm seeing a new bunch of faces from the MST over here, so welcome. Very briefly, Tom gave us a fascinating new view about some of the relationships between knowledge and achievement and how we might begin to think about their value. Tonight, I believe we're going to hear a little more about how that view can be developed to help in our thinking about ethics. So, Tom, thank you so much again for joining us, and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thanks again. Thanks for returning. You weren't put off too much by the first lecture. So let's go on to the second. So my first lecture discussed the intrinsic goods of knowledge and achievement in general or as such, emphasizing the parallels between them and based on parallel accounts of their natures. I assume the traditional view that the two are compounds of simpler elements, so knowledge involves justified true belief and achievement involves competent, successful intention. But I argued that each also requires a connection between these elements, though the connections run in opposite directions. To know that P, not only must you have a justified true belief that P, but the facts that make P true must help explain why your belief is justified, for example, by being the causal origin of a significant part of your evidence. This connection runs outside in. To achieve P, you must competently and successfully pursue P, but the features that make your pursuit competent must help explain why it succeeded. This connection is inside out. Requiring these connections yields the intuitive verdicts in many cases from the epistemology and achievement literatures and invokes G.E. Moore's principle of organic unities, which says the value of a whole needn't equal the sum of the values its parts would have on their own. Thus, the value of knowledge doesn't equal the sum of the values of merely justified and merely true belief, but is greater, given the required connection. The value of achievement is likewise greater than the sum of those of competent and successful pursuit. Nor are these accounts objectionably gerrymandered. They rest on the comparatively simple idea that it's better when two good-making properties, truth and justification, or competence and success, are connected than not. On their own, justified belief and true belief have some value, as do competent and successful pursuit. But it's better and makes for the full value of knowledge or achievement when one of the two helps explain the other. But a complete account must also explain what makes for degrees of value in these goods. Some knowledge, for example of a fundamental scientific law, is very worth having just in itself, but some, such as about the number of blades of grass in a lawn, is not. There's significant versus trivial knowledge, and there are also significant versus trivial achievements. Climbing Mount Everest or finding a cure for cancer is a significant achievement, whereas tying a shoelace is not. Some instances of each good are better than others, with the difference resting in each case on one between significance and triviality. A full account must explain this difference or identify the features of knowledge and achievement that make for significance, and that's the topic of my lecture today. First, though, there's a background issue. I'm going to assume that the overall value of your knowledge or achievement, either at a time or through time, depends on two things: the number of instances of that good you have and their degrees of significance. This general model mirrors ones commonly used in hedonist and desire fulfillment views, which consider both how many pleasures or fulfilled desires you have and their degrees of intensity. By similarly counting the number of truths you know, the model captures the intuitive idea that if you gain a new item of knowledge without losing any old ones, you improve your cognitive state. It also fits the more abstract idea that knowledge and achievement involve a match between your mind and the world, since the more matching states you're in, the more overall matching you've done. It may be objected, however, that counting the number of these states is impossible, since it's always infinite. If you know P, don't you also know P and P, P and P and P, and so on? But a similar objection can be made to desire fulfillment views, since there's the same reason to think that if you desire P, you also desire its logical equivalence. And in neither case is the difficulty insuperable, at least in principle. We can imagine a division of truth into a large but finite set of kinds, so P, and so on are all in the same kind, and making knowing an additional truth in a given kind have either no value or value that diminishes rapidly towards zero, then what matters most for the value of your knowledge isn't the number of individual truths you know, but the number of kinds in which you know truths, or how diverse your knowledge is. I mean, it's not that the required division into kinds is given by nature as some kind of non-evaluative fact, making it an evaluative exercise reflecting the evaluative thought that it's better to know a greater variety of truths, or perhaps that if two propositions are made true by the same facts, it isn't much or at all better to know both. But if I can assume that a general model, assuming that a general model that counts instances of knowledge and achievement can be vindicated in some such way, we can turn to its account of significance. That's my term for what makes for greater and lesser degrees of value in knowledge and achievement. So this account will give knowledge of a trivial truth about blades of grass just minimal value, so making an effort to acquire it will almost always be counterproductive, since it almost always prevents you from doing something better. But some may deny that this kind of knowledge, some may think that this kind of knowledge has no value whatever. This is sometimes said in arguments that knowledge in general has no value. Can I tell an anecdote? So many years ago, I was interviewed unsuccessfully for a folding chair at Harvard, and Robert Nozick was one of the interviewers, and I was talking about the value of knowledge. What? Is it intrinsically good to know the number of grains of sand in Coney Island Beach? I didn't have as good an answer as I might have. Anyways, so some people think that trivial knowledge has no value whatever. And that view could be accommodated by introducing a threshold on the scales of significance, so only instances of knowledge or achievement above the threshold have value. And Gwen Bradford says something like that about significant achievements. But it involves a standard difficulty in all threshold views. It implies that a large number of states just below the threshold have less value together than a single one just above it, which to me is unintuitive. So I'll therefore assume that all instances of knowledge or achievement that meet the model's other conditions have at least some value. If some prefer a threshold view, they can substitute it in what follows. So the account of significance I'm going to develop updates the one in my book Perfectionism, 30 years ago, it's hard to believe, and uses parallel measures for knowledge and achievement. I have to say, if anyone has just been reading chapters 9 and 10 of that book, then some of what I'm going to say will be familiar. I apologize for that, but there will be new material and corrections, and I hope a better presentation of the ideas. But the basic ideas, many of the basic ideas are the same, and I have to give them because they're needed to complete the parallels between knowledge and achievement, which were the theme of the first lecture, and there also will be needed to generate many of the more applied conclusions that I'm going to draw in the third lecture. Anyway, so the account of significance will use parallel measures for knowledge and achievement. The account says the degree of value of an instance of either good. By the way, does everyone have handouts? Yes. Yes? The degree of value of an instance of either good depends on its generality in two senses of generality. I begin with knowledge, where something close to it was defended by W.D. Ross. And there's a quote from him on the handout. With an acknowledgement to F.H. Bradley, Ross said, and this is the quote, "Knowledge of general principles is intellectually more valuable than knowledge of isolated matters of fact, and the more general the principle, the more facts it's capable of explaining, the better the knowledge. Our ideal in the pursuit of knowledge is system, and system involves the tracing of consequence to their ultimate grounds. Our aim is to know not only the that, but the why, where there is a why." These remarks, however, run together two different senses of generality. How many facts a truth is capable of explaining, that's one of Ross's phrases, is a feature it has on its own and can have even if you haven't used it to explain anything. But there can only be system, or the tracing of consequence to their ultimate grounds, those are further phrases of Ross's, if you've actually done the explaining. I'll therefore distinguish a truth's intrinsic generality, which depends just on its own internal content, from its relative generality, which is a matter of how many other truths you've used it to explain and understand. Each will have some bearing on the degree of value of an item of knowledge, though the second may have more. To start with intrinsic generality, a truth could explain more if it concerns or applies to more things. Thus, laws of motion that govern all objects at all times and places can explain more and are in this sense more general than ones just about falling bodies on Earth or the orbits of the planets. And an extension of this idea says that truth is more intrinsically general and so more worth knowing if the state of affairs, it affirms, is more encompassing or includes more objects at more times and places. In this sense, a truth about the blades of grass in a lawn isn't at all general, since it concerns just one lawn at one place and time. But a law governing all objects everywhere is highly general. Now, the value of intrinsic generality as so understood can be grounded in part in its connection with rationality. If we humans can be in more valuable cognitive states than non-human animals, it's partly because our thinking isn't confined to our immediate physical surroundings now. We can grasp and know truths about longer stretches of time, for example, from the distant past into the future, or that include faraway objects. Doing so exercises rational powers that are both distinctive of us and impressive. And this value can also be connected to the idea that knowledge involves matching your mind to the world. Just as you do this more, the more truths you know, so you do it more, the more of the world the truths you know concern. You mirror more of reality if what you mirror includes more of what there is. Bradley, who I said Ross got his ideas largely from, suggested this last idea when he asked of an item of knowledge, how much of my world is contained and involved in it? That's a question about how valuable the knowledge is. As, I think, Bertrand Russell did when in the last sentence of The Problems of Philosophy, he gave the following reason to study philosophy. Through the greatness of the universe which philosophy contemplates, the mind is also rendered great and becomes capable of that union with the universe which constitutes its highest good. I think the greatness of the universe is sort of its extent, and when you, apparently he thinks that right now we're communing with the universe in doing philosophy, but you kind of think these abstract general thoughts which have this tremendously extended content. Anyways, this form of generality can't be measured in any simple or especially linear way. If it were, knowing a scientific law would have not just more value than knowing some particular fact, but vastly more than is credible. The value of additions to it must therefore diminish and have an upper bound. There may also be something like this kind of significance in knowing particular facts that are remote in time or space, for example, about an event in ancient Rome or the chemical composition of a distant star. Though not extended in its specific content, this knowledge too takes your mind beyond the here and now. And there may be more value in knowing an extended truth when you can identify and thus have knowledge of the individuals it involves as individuals than when you know it just as an abstract generalization. If so, that's a further limit on the value of knowing a scientific law just as a law. Though there are many further issues about this measure, the basic idea is that knowledge is intrinsically better the more extended and encompassing its content. And a parallel measure for achievement makes a goal more significant and therefore more worth realizing, the greater its extent in the times, places, and objects, perhaps especially persons, it involves. Its ground can again be in part that pursuing and realizing intrinsically general goals exercises rational powers not had by other animals, who can intentionally affect only their immediate vicinity now. It can also be in part that if achievement involves making the world match your mind, you do that more the more of the world your goal includes. And there can again be a related value in realizing a particular goal that's remote in time or space, such as you're standing atop some distant mountain 2 years from today. You can't achieve any goal as extended as some truths you know, thus you can't affect, though you can know about, objects light years away. But a measure of intrinsic generality broadly parallel to that for knowledge can be part of what makes for degrees of value in achievement. So, among this last measure's many implications, one says there's intrinsic value in having a goal for your life as a whole or for some long stretch of it and being guided in your individual actions by that temporally extended end. I think Aristotle, for one, thought having this kind of goal was part of a good life. Another finds value in goals that connect you to states before or after your life, as when you try to continue a tradition established earlier by others and to keep it available for those who will follow. I was talking to Jeff just the other day. Do people know Samuel Scheffer's book, Death in the Afterlife, where the suggestion is that if we learned that the human race was going to die out 30 years from now, we'd see no point in living? And his reason is that then we couldn't sort of see what we're doing now as, helping other generations in the future continue an activity that we're doing now and that perhaps that was handed to us by generations before. I have to say, I mean, to me, Scheffler's conclusion is kind of wildly exaggerated. There's lots of valuable things we could do, even if we knew the human race was going to die out in 30 years. I wouldn't stop playing golf, for example. And I also wouldn't stop doing philosophy. I don't have the idea that my work will be affecting thinkers 200 years from now. But that aside, I mean, I think there is something, you know, what Scheffler is talking about is a value. There's a value in being able to aim at goals that don't involve just your own condition now, but maybe connect your activities to the activities of people in the past, let's say philosophers in the past, and enable an activity to be continued in the future by future generations. And that can be seen as one aspect of what I'm calling intrinsic generality, where your goal is extended in time and also here in the number of people that you're thinking of affecting. So it's not just Samuel Scheffler. You know, Nietzsche seemed to care about extent in time because Nietzsche especially valued temporally extended goals. He lauded someone who can, quote, extend his will across great stretches of his life, or a cast that, quote, would be able to cast its goals millennia hence. Anyways, many such goals involve states of other people, which the measure likewise sees as valuable. This may explain why, for many classical philosophers such as Aristotle, the prime exemplar of an active or practical life was more specifically a political life. That makes sense if there's additional value in realizing goals that include many people, as political leaders distinctively do. Intrinsic generality is also found in cooperative activities, where you intend what you do in part as contributing to a more extended goal, where a larger group that includes you works jointly towards a common end. There again, you aim at something beyond yourself. In parallel with a claim about knowledge, there may be more value when, as part of a cooperative venture, you try to and do affect how the others act than when acting on your own. You aim just to add your activities to theirs. But anytime you pursue and help realize a goal that involves other people, there's some added value in your goal's greater extent. Well, though I'm reasonably confident that intrinsic generality is one factor affecting the degrees of value in knowledge and achievement, I'm less certain what its best specification is, nor am I certain how much weight it has or how much in the significance of these goods turns on this matter of extent. So let me turn to the possibly more important value of relative generality and start again with knowledge. In this second sense, a truth's generality is a matter of its relation to other things you know, or its place in Ross's explanatory system of knowledge. In such a system, you use some truths you know to explain and understand others. And a truth's relative generality depends on the extent to which it plays this role, or the number of other truths it's helped you to understand. You may know one truth, also know that it explains several others, and thereby understand those others. This makes your knowledge of the first truth relatively general, with its generality greater the more other truths you've used it to explain. So in this sense, too, a truth about blades of grass isn't general, since it can't be used to explain anything. In Ross's language, it's an isolated matter of fact. But a law or other abstract principle can be general if you use it to explain and understand many things. To play this role, a truth must have some intrinsic generality or some extended content. But the two forms of significance don't always go together. You can use a law with a restricted subject matter, such as the geology of the Earth, to explain more things than you use a more extended one to explain. Then your knowledge of the first is more relatively general. I was once hiking in a park north of Toronto, and there was a pond with turtles in it, for example. And it was clear that there were biologists at one of the Ontario universities were just studying that pond. And they would come up and they would know all about how changes in the temperature of the water affected the population of this species and that species. They would have been kind of doing the ecology of the pond. And on the one hand, their subject matter is quite narrow. But on the other hand, they would have had a lot of explanatory integration of facts about that pond. And that's just a case where not that much intrinsic generality, but a lot of relative generality. On the other side, some intrinsically particular facts can have great relative generality, as when a historian understands how a particular battle or judicial decision led to and explains a great many later events. Although they often overlap, the two forms of generality are distinct. The value of relative generality can again be grounded in the ideas that connecting items of knowledge in the way that makes for understanding exercises rational powers not had by other animals, and that if explanatory connections are part of reality, it's important to match your mind to them. Now in other writings, now you have to start looking at the handout where the diagrams are. In other writings, I've illustrated this measure with diagrams where each node represents a truth you know, and a line running from one node down to another means you know how the first truth explains the second. Compare Figure 1, which represents 7 unconnected items of knowledge, with Figure 2, where you've used the truth at the top to explain and understand the 6 below. Figure 2 contains more relative generality, and a simple, I'm sure way too simple, model can explain how. Imagine that each item of knowledge has 1 unit of value in itself, just as an item of knowledge, plus 1 via relative generality for every other item of knowledge you've used it to explain. Then Figure 1 contains 7 units of value, 1 for each node, whereas Figure 2 contains 6 in the bottom row, plus 7 in the top node, 1 for itself, plus 1 via relative generality for each other truth it explains, for a total of 13, or almost twice as much. And there's even more value in the more complex structure of Figure 3, where we use the truth at the top to explain the 2 in the middle, and each of them to explain the 2 below it. Here there are 4 units of value in the bottom row, 3 in each node in the middle row, and 7 in the top node, for a total of 17 in the structure as a whole. The more integrated understanding in Figure 3, or its greater degree of what Ross called system, makes via relative generality for more significance and value. And again, I don't attach any significance to that particular way of assigning numbers. That's supposed to be the most simple-minded way of doing it. So relative generality, as so understood, involves another organic unity, since it can make the value of a body of knowledge greater than the sum of the values its parts would have on their own. I've located the added value in the higher items in a structure, for example in the top and second rows of Figure 3, but it could equally well be assigned to lower ones, so they have more value the more items there are above them, or following more to the body of knowledge as a whole, which means in effect to the explanatory relations it involves. Though all 3 options can find the same total values, for example the same 17 units in Figure 3, I find it most intuitive to locate the added value of explanatory relations as Ross did in the knowledge that does the explaining. So far I've taken the nodes in the diagrams to represent items of knowledge, but there can also be some relative generality and therefore some value in the absence of knowledge. Imagine that first, that while you know all the truths in the bottom 2 rows in Figure 3, you have an unjustified false belief that P at the top, as well as unjustified false beliefs that P explains the truths below it. Since your beliefs about P don't meet any of the conditions for intrinsic value, they don't meet any of the conditions for knowledge, the top node adds no value to the diagram. But this leaves the generality and value in the nodes below it unchanged. Those in the middle row still have their 3 units, and those below it have their 1. So value at the bottom of one of these structures is safe from failings at the top. Now imagine that your belief that P at the top of Figure 3, though false, is justified by your evidence, as are your beliefs that P explains the truths below it. They too are false, though false, are justified. But the bottom 2 rows are still knowledge. I've said that merely true and merely justified beliefs have some, though lesser value, and their degrees of value can again depend on their generality. If merely justified belief has, say, half the value of knowledge, then your justified false belief that P has 0.5 units of value in itself, half of 1, as merely justified, rather than a full unit, plus half times 6 equals 3 units in virtue of your justified false beliefs about what it explains. That gives it a total of 0.5 plus 3 equals 3.5 units of value, or half the 7 it would have if all your beliefs about it were knowledge. And again, the numbers don't matter. The point is that you can have relations like those that hold between items of knowledge. When you have no understanding that involves knowledge, the same relations can hold between beliefs that fall short of knowledge, let's say because they're justified but false. And there will be less value, but there will still be some value there. And if the beliefs below this top one are likewise justified but false, the value of using it to explain any one of them is now a half times a half equals a quarter, rather than a half times 1 equals 5. Again, replacing knowledge with merely justified belief reduces the generality value by half. So states that fall short of knowledge can then still have value, including some generality value, but it's reduced value. More generally, on the view I'm proposing, the ideal for cognition is a composite, where the best beliefs both meet all the conditions for knowledge and, in addition, have a high degree of significance. But just as there can be some value in knowledge without significance, as in knowledge of some trivial truth, so there can be some value in significance without all the elements of knowledge. Now, so like I've said, what the measure of relative generality values is understanding, which, like kind of many views in the literature, it equates with seeing the connections between items of information. But where it takes this in its best form to involve knowledge, some philosophers argue that understanding is a distinct state from knowledge and more valuable than knowledge, so it and not knowledge should be our primary cognitive goal. But that argument may rest on the atomist assumption that the value of a body of knowledge must equal the sum of the values its constituents would have on their own, and so can't involve a relational state like understanding. But this, again, ignores the possibility of an organic unity. There's no reason why the value of a collection of items of knowledge can't depend on the relations between them, especially when those involve knowing how some explain others, or no reason why understanding can't be an especially valuable form of knowledge. Some others say understanding is distinct from knowledge because it doesn't require knowledge. You can understand Q by relating it to explanatory proposition P, even though that your belief is that P is true only because of some Gettier-style luck, or even if it's false. And I think in the discussion on Monday, somebody raised this possibility that if you know something because you picked, there's 8 books in the library and 7 of them have false information, and you accidentally pick the one with true information. The claim is that you don't know what you read in the book, but the claim was that if you use it to explain something, you nonetheless have understanding. So that's the idea, that you can have understanding without knowledge. But I've just said, the relations that make for understanding, when they hold between items of knowledge, can also hold between items that fall short of knowledge, say because they're justified but false, or justified and true but Gettiered. To me, it's then just a verbal question whether what results deserves the name understanding. The view I just described calls it understanding. Other people say you can't have understanding in the absence of knowledge. You can't say, I understand why P, but I don't know why P. That's absurd. I don't have any view about that question. It seems to me entirely terminological. The relation that makes for understanding when it holds between items of knowledge can also hold between items that are not knowledge, and it can have similar, though in my view, lesser value. And I just don't think it matters whether we call it understanding. In particular, nothing prevents the same relations from making for the best kind of knowledge, so that involves understanding, or for themselves being at their best when the items they hold between are knowledge. So hope people are with me. Anyways, the measure of relative generality for knowledge can be elaborated in 2 ways. One finds more value in the explanation and understanding of more varied or diverse truths. Many think the greatest intellectual advances come when a new principle unifies realms that had previously been thought distinct, as when, for example, Newton gave a single explanation of the motions of bodies on Earth and of planets around the sun. This is more illuminating than giving yet more explanations of essentially similar facts. Well, that idea can be captured if we extend the division of truths into kinds, so truths on a similar topic count as in the same kind, and then make a truth's relative generality greater when it's used to explain more different kinds of truth, or when it has more varied kinds below it in an explanatory structure. Then a unified understanding of diverse truths will be better than an equally unified understanding of similar ones. A second elaboration values knowledge more when it's more precise. You might know vaguely that falling objects on Earth accelerate at a rate somewhere between 8 and 12 meters per second squared, or more precisely that the rate is 9.8 meters per second squared. In the second case, you you might be said to know a greater number of truths, since you know not only that the rate is between 8 and 10, 8 and 12, but also that it's between 8.5 and 11.5, 9 and 11, and so on. Those are very similar truths, but there can still be some more value in knowing them. You can also explain more precise, and again, arguably more numerous truths about the velocities of particular falling objects. Whether or not that particular derivations of the value of precision succeeds, I don't hang my hat on that. It's plausible that more precise knowledge is intrinsically better, so the best understanding uses extended and precise general truths to explain many precise and varied particular truths. So that's relative generality for knowledge. A similar measure can help determine the degrees of value in achievements. So the value of an achieved goal depends in part on its relation to other goals, and in particular on its importance in a structured system of goals. But the relation here is different than for knowledge, since achievement is a different good. An achieved goal is relatively general if you've used your achieving of many other goals as a means to achieving it. So it generates and unifies those other goals. So rather than explanatory, the relation here is instrumental or means end, and it runs up a diagram rather than down. So in an achievement version of figure 3, you might want to look back at that. The goals in the bottom row are achieved as means to the ones in the middle row, which in turn are achieved as means to the one at the top, which is the ultimate aim guiding them all. And a model parallel to that for knowledge says each achieved goal has one unit of value in itself, just as an achieved goal, plus one further unit via relative generality for every other goal that's achieved as a means to achieving it. So the 4 at the bottom in figure 3 have 1 unit each, the 2 in the middle 3 each, and the top one 7, for again a total of 17. Which again contrasts with the 13 units if you achieve one goal via 6, as in figure 2, or the 7 units in 7 unconnected goals. Or at least there are 13 units if all the goals in figure 3 are fully achieved, since there can still be some generality and value if that's not so. If your pursuit of the top goal is neither competent nor successful, it adds no value to the diagram, but that leaves the value in the lower rows intact, that the middle goals still have their 3 units. And if your pursuit of the top goal, though unsuccessful, is competent, it may have a half unit of value in itself, plus a half times 6 equals 3 units via relative generality for the other goals pursued as means to it, assuming that each of them is fully achieved. If one or more of them isn't fully achieved, say because your pursuit of it too is merely competent, there are further reductions, say to a half times a half equals a quarter for each such means. So this idea, that relative generality is making for significance in achievements, that can again be grounded in the thought that connecting goals in a multi-level means-end structure exercises rational powers that other animals don't have, and again overlaps often, but not always, with intrinsic generality. Often a more extended goal requires more other goals to be realized as means to it, but sometimes a very localized goal, such as that you stand atop a specific mountain on a specific day, can require many others as means to it. And sometimes you can realize a highly extended goal, such as one involving your whole society for decades to come, by just casting a vote in Parliament or making a judicial decision. Now, if what relative generality values on the cognitive side is understanding, here what it values is achievements that are complex and in that way difficult. Obviously, figure 3 is more complex than figure 2, which is more complex than figure 1. There are several ways this complexity can make for difficulty. When a means-end structure contains more goals first, there are more places where you can fail at something crucial, and so fail in your main pursuit. Thus, in figure 3, you need to achieve 7 distinct goals and also use 6 of them to achieve 1 or 2 others. There are therefore multiple points where a local failure can lead to failure overall. In addition, more complex structures demand more in the way of self-monitoring and executive control. You need to have an overall plan for your activity, keep track of where you are in the plan, and sequence your acts correctly to carry it out. That too is more difficult when the activity is more complex. And there are further sources of difficulty if the measure of relative generality is elaborated in ways parallel to the ones for knowledge. So one elaboration finds more generality and thus more value in achievements that involve varied rather than similar or repetitive means. An assembly line worker may make many individual movements as means to earning his day's pay, but his activity doesn't intuitively have great intrinsic worth. This is surely in large part because his movements are all essentially the same. And this will give his activity only limited value if relative generality counts not just or mainly the number of individual means to a goal, but the number of means of different kinds. So more varied means and structures are better, and repetitive ones lack worth. But varied structures also make for more difficulty, since the more kinds of goal you have to realize, the more different skills and therefore training you need to achieve them, and the more complex the planning and self-monitoring they require. Another elaboration makes it better to achieve more precise goals, both as your ultimate goal and as means to it. This is actually a common feature of valued achievements. So a skilled poet chooses a specific word that completes her line best. A musician plays a note at the precise moment that will have the greatest aesthetic impact. And a professional golfer hits his approach shot not just somewhere near the green, but within, say, 10 feet of the hole. As with knowledge, it might be possible to see more precise achievements as realizing more numerous goals, so the professional golfer hits his ball not just into a large circle around the green, but also into progressively smaller ones down to 10 feet. And that might give him a greater number of achieved goals, and in consequence, more relative generality in what he does. For significant value, however, these goals must be competently achieved. An amateur golfer, like me, always hits his ball to a precise spot, sometimes even close to the hole, but he doesn't do that intentionally or especially with competence. Given his limited skill, he can't knowingly select a swing with a higher probability of putting the ball near the hole. If that sometimes results, it's not something he controlled or was responsible for. But precise achievements, when competent, are again more difficult. The more narrowly defined your goal, the more ways you can fail to realize it, and the more skill and training it requires. Many achievements also involve a form of intrinsic generality, where you grasp a complex array of items as a single unit and then try to and do realize it as a unit. So hearing a melody for the first time, a skilled musician can immediately take it in as an ordered sequence and play it back correctly. Someone who's less musical may follow the melody's individual transitions, but not grasp it as a whole, and so be unable to reproduce it without further listenings. A chess master sees a position on the board as a connected pattern of forces and vulnerabilities, and when choosing a move, seeks mainly to alter that sort of global pattern rather than just change the location of one piece. Henry Moore was said to be able to see a complex form from all round itself. So the ability to represent and realize these complex wholes as units often has instrumental value, leading to better musical performances, chess strategies, and sculptures, but can also be good intrinsically as an exercise of innate or developed rationality. Achievements that require it are in that way again more difficult, requiring more talent or training and being easier to fail at. So the difficulty the generality measures value, and that I've been talking about, is objective, since it turns on properties of your goals apart from any specific relation to you or your abilities. This contrasts with Gwen Bradford's view, which is more subjective. She too values achievements in terms of their difficulty, but she understands difficulty in terms of effort. So it's when realizing a goal involves more effort that for her it has more worth. Since how much effort a goal requires can differ for different people, the difficulty she values is in that way subjective. Now, kind of subjective and objective understandings of difficulty overlap often, but not always. Tying a shoelace is objectively simple, and for most people requires little effort. But for someone with a disability, it can require great effort. It's therefore not much of an achievement on a complexity view, but can be one on Bradford's. Conversely, realizing a complex set of goals with little effort is valuable on a generality-based view, but not on hers. Now, so my claim here isn't that there's no value in simple but effortful success, as in a disabled person's tying a shoelace. It's just that whatever value there is in that form of achievement, there's also value in one that's like knowledge in turning more objectively on the two kinds of generality. In particular, there's value in this form that's ignored if achievement is understood only in terms of effort. In her book, Bradford describes a virtuoso violinist who effortlessly tosses off a flawless performance of a complex piece few other violinists can play. She calls what he does difficult because it would require effort from anyone else. But since it doesn't require effort from him, it isn't difficult for him, and so isn't, on her view, an achievement or anything of value when done by him. But surely his performance is a valuable achievement. Now, her view can find considerable value in the process by which he acquired his virtuoso skill, since there was great effort in the years of training. But once he has the skill, her view sees little point in his exercising it by playing complex pieces. He would do better, on her view, to give up the violin and expend effort in acquiring some new skill he can then again set aside once he has it. More generally, views like Bradford's make it hard to see the point of ever improving your skill. Skill has two effects. It allows you to do the same things with less effort and to do more complex ones with the same effort. Since on her view, neither of these makes for any increase in the value of what you do, there's no reason not to rest content with your current limited skill set. But surely serious musicians, chess players, and golfers all want to improve their skill so they can do objectively more difficult things. Bradford argues against a complexity view that carrying on a conversation in English is highly complex, yet not an achievement. But I have no difficulty in saying it is an achievement, even a significant one. I've often noted when some human capacity isn't shared by other animals, not because I think it's being distinctive of us matters as such, but because if our lives can have value that animals don't, it must be because of properties we have and they lack. And the ability to learn and use a language is absolutely one of these. Having conversations as such isn't a good that differentiates human lives from each other. You can't say his life is better because he can have conversations and he can't. But I don't see why that prevents it from being good at all. If all our lives contain some minimum amount of pleasure, would the pleasures being shared mean it wasn't good? And there can absolutely be some differences with respect to the good of conversing. Some languages are more complex than others, with more recursive structure, so speaking them is more of an achievement. Or compare the conversations of people who clumsily talk past each other with those of the characters in a Henry James novel, who convey precise information in subtly indirect ways that kindly avoid rudeness or hurt. What they do is, to me, absolutely a valuable achievement. As well as valuing individual difficult activities, the measure of relative generality joins the one of intrinsic generality in valuing a life with a long-term goal, say to live a life with a certain overall character. Not only does this goal include all the days or years in your life, that's intrinsic generality, it also has a great many other goals as means to it, namely all those you choose in part as contributing to it. Just as our distinctive human rationality is exercised in forming and pursuing a goal with that temporal extent, so it's exercised in organizing and pursuing all the other goals its realization requires. Nor must this type of goal be for your whole life. You can have a similarly unifying end for a year or a month or for a specific aspect of your life, such as your career or personal life. And the goal needn't, at least initially, be overly specific. You can, for instance, intend to be and remain active in politics, but leave it till later to decide what specific form that activity will take. Whatever its form, it will contribute to realizing what was always a temporally extended and organizing end. It's not that no life without this kind of end can be good. Achievement is just one good among others and can sometimes be outweighed by others. If pursuing a unified life deprives you of significant pleasure or knowledge, it may not be on balance best. There can also be competing aspects of achievement. In particular, a life that's lived chaotically or just from day to day can be high in achievement value if it contains many individual, complex, and difficult activities, their relative generality at a time compensating for the lack of generality through time. There may even be trade-offs between these two aspects of relative generality, the more global and the more local, with more focus on lifetime goals inhibiting the greatest momentary achievements, and full commitment to those achievements, limiting the attention you can give to organizing plans. I'm tempted to, to make an analogy with artistic careers, there are artists who kind of work in the same style throughout their career, refining it slightly, but there's kind of a unity to all the work they do. I can't give a highbrow example like from painting, but I think of B.B. King as a musician who kind of played the blues in the same way. And then there are other musicians who just have to keep on changing styles, perhaps because they need a new project to throw their energy into, to do the best works they can at a time. Maybe Bob Dylan and Picasso are people like that. Anyways, they're artists who change styles, and there might not be tremendous unity in their artistic output through time, but the lack of unity enabled them to produce individual outstanding works. Anyways, that's the idea. There can be a conflict between relative generality at the local level and at a more global level. In both aspects, though, my conclusions assume what can be called an all-times rather than a present-time reading of relative generality. On a present-time reading, a goal's relative generality at a time depends only on the number of other goals pursued as means to it at that time. On an all-times view, it depends on the number that are means to it at all the times it's pursued. So figure 4 is a version of figure 3 in which the nodes are extended horizontally to represent the length of time for which they're pursued. So at each time, you're pursuing the top goal, one from the middle and one from the bottom. On a present time view, this makes the top goal's value at a time always 3, the middle one's 2, and the bottom one's 1 for a total of 6. Right? Do you get this? You only count what's happening at an individual time. This contrasts with the 17 at a time I found by counting all the means to a goal whenever they're pursued. Only that all times calculation gives the top goal 7 units at a time. It also means that on a present time view, there's no more value in figure 4 than if at each of the 4 times you had a different top goal as in figure 5. Then your total value through the 4 times would still be 4 times 6 equals 24 rather than 4 times 17 equals 68. Do you see that if all that matters is what goal you're pursuing at a time, there wouldn't be any more value in having the same organizing goal through a time period rather than a different sort of goal at the top of the structure at each time. So a present time view therefore finds no more value in the greater complexity, difficulty, and unity when your bottom goals at the 4 times are directed to the same top goal than when they're not, i.e. no more value in figure 4 than in figure 5. Since I do want to value this complexity and unity, either in your life as a whole or in particular activities, I've understood the generality of achievement in the more inclusive all times way. That may, though, make for a disanalogy with the case of knowledge. Their at all times view says the value at a time of your knowing a truth depends not only on the number of other truths you use it to explain and understand then, but also on the number you used it to explain in the past, even though you can't now remember them, and those you will use it to explain in the future, though you have no idea now what they will be. Though that's a possible view, it may be more plausible to make the generality of an item of knowledge at a time depend only on what it helps you understand then. That would be a present time understanding of relative generality for knowledge. If so, that's a difference from the case of achievement, where to me, an all times version of relative generality seems preferable. So just to bring something out, given an all times view of achievement, what you do at one time can affect the value of what you do at other times. So in figure 4, realizing the far right bottom goal late in your activity increases the top goal's generality at earlier times too, for example, at the left of the diagram. This all times view therefore extends the organic unity at the core of relative generality, making more relations among your goals relevant to it than there would be with a present time view. But that facts about one time can affect values at another was always part of the account. Whether a belief about the past or future counts as knowledge depends on what was or will be the case then. And if you pursue a goal like preserving Venice, that's an example people know from Reasons and Persons, and after your death it's realized in a way that depends on your efforts, that makes your activity while you were alive successful and so an achievement. And that's true, moreover, even on a present time view. Even if a goal's relative generality at a time depends only on the means used to it then, whether your pursuit of it while alive counts as an achievement can depend on whether it's realized later. So that's Parfit's example. You work while you're alive for the preservation of Venice, and after you're dead, it turns out that Venice is preserved in a way that depends on your effort. So that means that your activity while you're alive was successful and an achievement, and that makes a difference in value, even if the value of your working for the preservation of Venice at a time depends only on the number of other things you're doing to preserve Venice at that time and not at other times. Okay, so though relative generality values activities that are complex and difficult, some may argue that there's an opposed value of simplicity, elegance, or efficiency when you take not more but fewer means to an end. Isn't it often a mark of skill and achievement to do things in a less rather than more complicated way? Isn't the resulting simplicity also a value and a contrary one? It is indeed intuitively a value, but it seems again to involve relations between your goals, albeit different ones. It may therefore be possible to incorporate it in something like a generality view. Often a choice is elegant or efficient because it achieves several goals at once or using just one means. Thus the Henry James conversationalists find words that both convey precise information and at the same time avoid the hurt of more direct speech. What they do may therefore be represented in Figure 6, with the goal at the bottom simultaneously realizing the two higher up. And the value this involves may be captured if we say a goal has more value the more other goals it helps to realize, or there are immediately above it in a structure of goals. I'm not certain exactly how best to combine this view with one that values complexity, but there should be a way, and the result can again be seen as valuing rationality, since rational powers are needed to select a goal because it will, as others won't, realize several other goals at once. I guess it's the value of two birds with one stone. That would be the idea. Okay. However exactly they're understood, and is applied to both knowledge and achievement, the generality measures are formal. They make the value of a truth or goal depend only on formal properties such as its extent and its relation to other truths or goals, and not on its substantive content. Intrinsic generality does favor knowledge of, say, physics over geology because of the greater extent of its principles, but relative generality doesn't do the same, or not to the same degree. As I've said, you can have more understanding or knowledge with more relative generality in geology than in physics, and the same holds more generally. Thus, you can have valuable understanding, something fairly restricted, like your friend's personality or car engines or 1960s popular music. And a similar variety of fields is possible for relatively general achievements. But one thing formal measures don't consider is the value of an object, whether of belief or pursuit. Aristotle, at least at one point, thought that the best knowledge must be of the best things in the universe, namely the unchanging divine substances. But that's not a credible view about secular knowledge. It's not intrinsically better to understand the nature and causes of pleasure than of pain, or of virtue than of vice. And Aristotle's view doesn't follow, it's excluded, if the tests for significant knowledge are purely formal, with something similar holding given parallel tests for achievements. Then it's not, as James Griffin for one held, a necessary condition for the value of an achievement that it be of an independently good goal. That doesn't mean there's no value in pursuing good goals. There is, but it's the distinct value of moral virtue. If that's taken to involve loving what's good, for example, desiring and pursuing what's good, and hating what's evil. Then if you pursue and realize a good goal, your activity can have two values, one of achievement, which is independent of the goal's value, and one of virtue, which depends on it. Consider as an illustration scientific research. Its goal is new knowledge, which is intrinsically good, and even better, as well as more extended, if it's knowledge not just for you, but for many people. But realizing this goal can also be complex and challenging. Think of the immensely involved process needed to confirm the existence of the Higgs boson. Successful research can therefore be multiply valuable. It can result in new knowledge, which is one good. If it's motivated by the desire for knowledge, it involves the further good of virtue, but it also involves, and can derive much of its value from, the achievement of reaching, by varied, precise, and therefore difficult means, that goal. Now, an obvious difficulty for a formal view of achievement is posed by evil goals. If you successfully carry out a complex plan aimed at torturing thousands of people, is that intrinsically good? Hedonist and desire fulfillment views face a similar difficulty about pleasure in other people's pain, or the fulfillment of a desire to cause them pain. And all three views can respond in either of two ways. One is to say these cases involve both a positive good of achievement, pleasure, or fulfillment, and alongside it, an evil of moral vice. The evil should, one hopes, outweigh the good, so the achievement, pleasure, or fulfillment is on balance bad, though this may be harder to guarantee for achievement than for the other two goods. The other response says that given an evil goal or object, any potential good is canceled, and the pursuit, pleasure, or fulfillment is only and purely evil. Now, that second response partly abandons a formal view of achievement, since it finds no value in achieving an evil goal. But it needn't abandon formality entirely. It needn't say that of the two achievements of good goals, the one with the better goal is therefore better as an achievement. Their values as achievements can still depend just on the goal's generality. Nor need it say that a good achievement must be of a good goal. It can also be of an intrinsically neutral one. In fact, the distinctive value of achievement is most clearly present when it's of a neutral goal, as it is in games and sports, as analyzed in my favorite book, The Grasshopper by Bernard Suits. So just his analysis. In playing a game, you aim at a goal that's intrinsically trivial, that a ball go into a hole in the ground, that you stand on top of a mountain, that the pieces on a chessboard finish in a certain pattern. But the game's rules forbid you to take the most efficient means to this goal. Thus, you may not pick the ball up, walk down the fairway, and drop it in the hole by hand. Nor may you take a helicopter up the mountain. You have to pursue the goal by means that are more indirect and therefore challenging, either because they involve more effort or because they're more complex, with more numerous, varied, and precise parts. Despite the triviality of your ultimate goal, success in a game isn't something we regard as valueless. We don't think people who devote their lives to mastering golf, climbing, or chess have wasted their time. They're admired for what are thought substantial achievements. If this admiration is warranted, the value of what they do can't derive from the value of its ultimate end, must instead depend on features of the process of realizing it, such as the formal ones of intrinsic and relative generality. To borrow the current cliches, it must be a value of process, not product, journey, not destination. The same value can be found, in other activities, for example, in business, where you may found a company and then make and keep it profitable. This can have instrumental value if you give customers a new benefit, but often there's no such benefit, your product being no better than some competitors. The world is arguably no better if more people drink Coke than Pepsi or use iPhones than Androids. But realizing a business goal can be highly complex, requiring integrated and intricate decisions about production, marketing, distribution, and more. Doing so can therefore be an achievement in the same way as success in a game, a matter more of how you realize a goal than of what that goal intrinsically is. In my first lecture, I said achievement has been a less commonly recognized intrinsic good than knowledge. One reason is that philosophers like Aristotle have distinguished theoretical from practical rationality and assumed that just as knowledge is the one intrinsic good of theory, so moral virtue is the one intrinsic good of practice. Ross in The Right and the Good makes a similar assumption. He says there are human faculties of sensation, cognition, and conation, and he thinks each of them has got one good, pleasure, knowledge, and virtue, one and only one for each. But there's no reason why there can't be two goods of conation, one of virtue and the other more closely paralleling knowledge of achievement. And failing to recognize achievement can mean failing to recognize some more specific good it underlies. Having said at the start of the Nicomachean Ethics that an activity with a goal external to itself can't have more value than that goal, Aristotle then argues that since possessing money has no value in itself, the activity of pursuing it, as in a money-making or business life, likewise has no value. But that ignores the value the process of pursuing a goal can have just as a process and apart from any value in its goal. It dismisses the value of what for many is a major life activity. Business activity can, to repeat, be instrumentally good if it provides customers with new benefits. It can also be instrumentally evil if it increases inequality or causes environmental harm. And it can involve vice if it's motivated only by a selfish desire for your own good and indifference to anyone else's. But alongside these other values, there can be the intrinsic value of pursuing and realizing through complex and difficult means a goal regardless of that goal's value. There can, in other words, be the distinctive value of achievement. So just to wrap up, I've given a brief sketch of an account of degrees of value in knowledge and achievement using parallel measures of intrinsic and relative generality. The sketch has left many questions unanswered. How exactly is intrinsic generality measured, and how much weight does it have compared to relative generality? How exactly does relative generality value the structuring of truths and goals? The model I gave with those diagrams was super simple. How, if at all, can the measure value both complexity and simplicity or elegance? Despite its incompleteness, the sketch should give some idea of what more specifically the knowledge and achievement most worth pursuing and promoting are, and it should also sort of extend the idea in the first lecture that you should think of knowledge and achievement as parallel goods involving parallel elements, though with internal relations that run in opposite directions. So the extension here is that in both cases, the measure of degree of value is something about either intrinsic generality or relative generality, even though relative generality involves different relationships. One, explanation, understanding in the one case, sort of means and achievement in the other. Anyways, that's this talk. In the final lecture on Friday, I'll discuss how these goods may be aims of social and government policy. So if you think that knowledge and achievement have intrinsic value, and you think that social policy should aim to make people's lives better, what specific policies or conclusions might follow from that? So if anybody cares, I'll talk about, what do I talk about? Oh, government support of the arts, education policy, meaningful work. I think there's one or two more. Anyways, but it'll be perfectionist social policy because the two are perfectionist goods. The focus, though, will be on specific aspects of social policy aimed at those specific intrinsic goods. Thank you.